Today's Hisham Sharabi Memorial Lecture is entitled Deja Vu All Over Again, Iraq, Iran, and the Israel Lobby. And I wonder if the folks up in Cambridge know that you're quoting Yogi Berra. But I think I think it's very much appropriate, though, for the conversation around the impending, or hopefully not, war that we're hearing about so often, and the beating of the war drums. And so we're very happy to have with us today Dr. Stephen Walt, who writes extensively on these issues on his blog at Foreign Policy, and of course is a very accomplished scholar of international relations within the framework of realist international theory, and a professor, the Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University, and the co-author, most recently along with John Mearsheimer, of the Israel Lobby. A book which contributed much to the discussion in recent years about the role pro-Israel interest groups play in American foreign policy. For those viewing online, we invite you to participate in our discussion through the chat roll on our live stream page where you're watching, through Facebook, and also through Twitter by sending messages to @Palestine Center. So we'll be happy to relay your questions to Professor Stephen Walt at the end of the talk during our question and answer session. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Walt.
It is a pleasure to be here today and an honor to be asked to deliver the annual Hisham Sharabi Lecture. Previous speakers in this series have set a rather high standard for me, and I'll do my best to live up to the example they've set. I want to start, however, by thanking Yusuf for the invitation, the staff and supporters of the Palestine Center for making this event possible, and of course I especially want to thank all of you for coming. Over the past few months, we've seen an intense debate over the possibility of war with Iran. The United States and Iran have been at odds for many years. The United States has long been concerned about its nuclear research program. There have been several moments in the past where the danger of war seemed real. Remember, the Bush administration once hoped that winning a quick and decisive victory in Iraq would allow it to turn on Iran and force regime change there as well. Now, Iraq didn't work out quite the way Bush and company expected. But that debacle hasn't stopped a number of people and groups from suggesting that Israel or the United States should launch a preventive war to retard Iran's nuclear program. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has repeatedly described a nuclear-armed Iran as an existential threat and warned of a second Holocaust. Some of Israel's most vocal defenders in the United States have echoed these views. Sympathetic journalists have published articles suggesting Israel was likely to attack if Iran did not stop its nuclear activities. Most Republican presidential hopefuls described Iran as a looming danger, rejected policies designed to contain it, and said they would use force if elected. Now, needless to say, this all sounds eerily familiar. In the 1990s, American neoconservatives portrayed Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a major threat to U.S. interests and began a prolonged campaign to persuade Americans to use force to overthrow him. Their efforts did not bear fruit immediately, but President Bush and Vice President Cheney embraced their ideas after 9/11 and led the country into a war that cost more than $1 trillion, the lives of more than 4,500 Americans and more than 100,000 Iraqis, and weakened America's strategic position in the Gulf. Yet just a few years later, we are again debating whether to launch another preventive war in the same region and for much the same reasons. So today I want to compare the earlier campaign for war with Iraq with the current campaign for military action against Iran. I'm going to make three main points. First, I'm going to argue there are important similarities between these two situations. Specifically, in both cases, the main driving force behind the campaign for war are hardline individuals and groups in the Israel Lobby. By Israel Lobby, I mean groups or individuals in the United States who work actively and openly to promote a special relationship between the two countries, one where the United States gives Israel generous economic, military, and diplomatic support, and more or less unconditionally. These groups are not the only reason why the United States went to war against Iraq. They didn't cause the war by themselves. But absent their activities, the United States would not have invaded Iraq in 2003, and we would not be debating war with Iran today. I will then talk about the important differences between 2003 and 2012. The pro-Israel community in the United States is not united on the issue of war with Iran. Israel's own national security community is even more divided over the idea of preventive war. And most importantly, the Obama administration is much less inclined to war than the Bush administration was. Third, these differences are a very good thing, because a military attack on Iran would be a major strategic blunder. And this point underscores a broader lesson. The most influential groups in the Israel lobby consistently promote policies that are harmful to nearly everyone, including Israel itself. Finally, this counterproductive approach to Iran distracts us from a variety of other problems, most notably the continued dispossession of the Palestinians and denial of their political rights. That issue is not my main concern today, but is one we should not forget. Let me start by talking a little bit about the war with Iraq. When John Mearsheimer and I first published our work on the Israel lobby back in 2006, perhaps no claim was more controversial than our argument that the lobby had played a key role in the decision to invade Iraq. It was clear by then that the war had been a huge blunder. It is hardly surprising that individuals and groups who had helped to bring it about sought to deny responsibility afterwards. Our critics could not refute our arguments directly, however, so they chose to misrepresent them or to portray us falsely as anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists. But what did we actually write? In our original article and subsequent book, we said, quote, "The driving force behind the Iraq war was a small band of neoconservatives. It was the neocons who dreamed up the idea of using U.S. power to topple Saddam. It was the neocons who openly advocated this course from the mid-1990s onward. Their efforts included a series of open letters addressed to President Clinton, numerous articles and op-eds in places like the Weekly Standard, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post. It's important to emphasize that this idea did not come from the American military, the State Department, the intelligence community, or the oil industry. As Tom Friedman of the New York Times told an interviewer in 2005, Iraq was the war the neoconservatives wanted, the war the neoconservatives marketed. I could give you the names of 25 people here in Washington who, if you had exiled them to a desert island in 2001, the Iraq war would not have happened." He was right. Now, as you know, neoconservatives are an especially hawkish faction within the broader Israel lobby. As one prominent neoconservative, Max Boot, wrote in Foreign Policy, steadfast support for Israel, quote, "is a key tenet of neoconservatism." And virtually all the most prominent neoconservatives, like Boot himself, William Kristol, James Woolsey, Robert Kagan, Elliot Cohen, Paul Wolfowitz, Elliot Abrams, etc., are ardent defenders of the special relationship. Many neoconservatives held important positions in the Bush administration where they played key roles in pushing for war against Iraq. For example, at the first meeting at Camp David after 9/11, Paul Wolfowitz argued for invading Iraq before Afghanistan, even though bin Laden was in Afghanistan and there was no evidence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. Neoconservatives outside the government expressed similar views, with Robert Kagan and William Kristol calling for regime change in Iraq right after 9/11, well before the Taliban had been toppled from power. A few months later, in April 2002, Neocon Project for a New American Century released yet another open letter, this time urging President Bush to, quote, "accelerate plans for removing Saddam Hussein." So the role of the neoconservatives is really beyond dispute. But what about groups like AIPAC or the other major organizations in the lobby? They didn't initiate the idea of invading Iraq, and they do not appear to have done much to convince President Bush to decide on war. Instead, these groups played an important role in convincing Congress and the American people to support Bush's plan. For example, in the months preceding the war, AIPAC's biweekly Near East report published numerous articles highlighting the danger from Iraq, including an interview with Kenneth Pollack of the Sabin Center at Brookings. Pollack, as you most know, was the author of The Threatening Storm, a book that argued regime change in Iraq was necessary because Saddam was undeterrable. Pollack's boss at the Sabin Center was Martin Indyk, the former deputy director of research at AIPAC, co-founder of the pro-Israel Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and both men wrote articles and op-eds calling for war in late 2002 and 2003. But there's more. In 2003, AIPAC Executive Director Howard Korer told the New York Sun that one of AIPAC's success stories in 2002 was, quote, quietly lobbying Congress to approve the resolution authorizing the use of force. This wasn't just idle bragging. John Judas of the New Republic later recounted that Senate staffers had told him personally about AIPAC's pre-war lobbying, and AIPAC spokesperson Rebecca Needler told the Jewish Telegraph Agency, quote, if the president asks Congress to support action in Iraq, AIPAC will lobby members of Congress to support him. And they did. I might add that Nathan Gutman of the Jewish newspaper The Forward and Jeffrey Goldberg, then of The New Yorker, also wrote articles saying AIPAC had lobbied in favor of war. In addition to AIPAC, the Jewish Council on Public Affairs and Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations passed resolutions endorsing the use of force. The chairman of the President's Conference, publisher Mortimer Zuckerman, was especially outspoken about the need to topple Saddam. Not to be outdone, David Harris of the American Jewish Committee pointedly asked, do we have to wait until a target is hit and the world says, ah yes, he did have weapons of mass destruction? Or as The Forward recalled in a 2004 editorial, as President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. Finally, prominent Christian Zionists also backed the war, with Reverend John Hagee, founder of Christians United for Israel, telling his followers, if Saddam Hussein is allowed to dictate the terms of this war, the front lines will explode in American cities with a death toll too staggering to comprehend. Saddam must go. In short, the role of the neoconservatives and the other key organizations in the lobby cannot really be denied. Now, it's important to be clear about what I'm not saying, because so many critics get our story wrong. First, we did not claim the neocons or other groups were all powerful or that they started the war by themselves. Their initial effort to convince Clinton to go to war failed, and they were unable to persuade either Bush or Cheney to favor war until after 9/11. If 9/11 had never happened, the United States would probably never have invaded Iraq. The lobby's activities were a necessary condition for war, but not a sufficient condition by themselves. Second, the war was not the result of some secret cabal or conspiracy. On the contrary, the neoconservatives made their case openly and went to great lengths to publicize their views, as did leaders of major pro-Israel organizations. And of course, they were happy to take credit for it afterwards, that is, until the war started to go south. And as we emphasized repeatedly, there was nothing illegitimate about their lobbying for war, even if it was in fact a very bad idea. Third, the war party did not push this policy because they thought it would be good for Israel and bad for the United States. Rather, they thought it would be good for both countries. They were tragically mistaken, of course, but not disloyal. Fourth, the idea of invading Iraq did not originate with Israel. In fact, Israeli officials were skeptical at first because they wanted the United States to go after Tehran first. That's another reason, by the way, why AIPAC was initially quiet. They didn't get fully on board until Israel decided to go along. Israel backed the war after the Bush administration explained that Iraq was just the first step and that Iran would be dealt with afterwards. And at that point, key Israeli leaders like Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, and Benjamin Netanyahu helped sell the war here in America through interviews with the press, op-eds in prominent American newspapers, and appearances on Capitol Hill. Fifth, consider what might have happened had the major organizations in the lobby pursued a different course of action. Suppose AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents had encouraged a lively debate and helped Congress sift the pros and cons of war in a fair-minded way. What if the Israeli government had recognized the dangers of the war and encouraged AIPAC and the Conference of Presidents to oppose it? What if the major organizations had done so on their own? It's possible that Bush, Cheney, and the neocons would have still managed to take us over the brink, but it would have been substantially more difficult. Opposition or neutrality from the major pro-Israel organizations would have encouraged Congress to think twice about the issues, given them good reasons to slow the rush for war. We might have had a real debate about the military requirements, the risks of a costly quagmire. But of course, the problem wasn't that key organizations in the lobby failed to speak out against the war. The problem was that many of them actively endorsed it. Finally, in our book, we emphasized that it would be wrong to blame American Jews for the war. In fact, surveys of American public opinion show that the American Jewish population was less supportive of the war than the American people as a whole. Rather, the blame lies with President Bush and his advisors, who made the ultimate decision, with the neoconservatives, who dreamed up the war and sold it to Bush and Cheney, and with the major groups in the lobby, who did much to sell it inside and outside the Beltway. So let me now turn to the issue of Iran, which is in some ways similar, but in other ways quite different. If Israel did not exist and there was no Israel lobby, the United States might still have a contentious relationship with Iran. Iranians resent the U.S. role in the 1953 coup that restored the Shah to power, as well as our support for Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq War. Similarly, Americans remember the hostage crisis that followed the fall of the Shah, and we worry about Iran's potential to dominate the oil-rich Persian Gulf. The United States would undoubtedly oppose any Iranian effort to obtain nuclear weapons because we have long sought to slow nuclear proliferation. So the Israel lobby is not the only reason the United States and Iran have been wary of each other. Nonetheless, both Israel and the lobby have long encouraged the United States to take a hardline stance toward Iran and sought to block any efforts at rapprochement between Tehran and Washington. In the 1990s, the United States adopted the strategy of dual containment, which committed us to deterring both Iran and Iraq simultaneously. This strategy was the brainchild of Martin Indyk again, who was then Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs. And according to Indyk's associate, Ken Pollack, as well as author Trita Parsi, dual containment was adopted largely to reassure Israel. In 1994, AIPAC responded to growing Israeli concerns by preparing a lengthy paper portraying Iran as a threat to Israel and the United States alike. Throughout the rest of the decade, it pushed hard for increasingly stringent sanctions on Iran, such as the 1996 Iran-Libya Sanctions Act. It also opposed several Iranian attempts to improve relations and successfully lobbied President Clinton to block an oil deal between Iran and Conoco in 1996. The neoconservatives in the Bush administration were as hostile to Iran as they were to Iraq, and again, they believed regime change would include Tehran as well as Baghdad. In May 2003, when it looked like the United States had won a stunning victory in Iraq, William Kristol wrote in the Weekly Standard that the job wasn't finished and that the next great battle will be for Tehran. Other neoconservatives echoed this hope. The neocons' fantasies of regional transformation evaporated when Iraq turned into a costly quagmire, and it soon became clear that Saddam's overthrow had backfired by enhancing Iran's regional influence. Nonetheless, the Bush administration continued to insist Iran had to suspend all nuclear enrichment before any negotiations could begin, in the process rejecting Iranian offers to limit enrichment to little more than a small research and development effort. In essence, Washington was demanding that Iran give us what we wanted most up front, at which point we might be willing to talk about any concerns that they might have. Not surprisingly, this approach was a complete failure. Iran had exactly 0 centrifuges spinning when Bush took office, and roughly 4,000 operating when Bush's second term ended. Nonetheless, a national intelligence estimate in 2007 concluded that Iran had suspended its research on nuclear weapons back in 2003 and had no active weapons program underway. That finding was consistent, by the way, with Iran's repeated insistence that it did not seek nuclear weapons, and with Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei's declaration that nuclear weapons were in fact contrary to Islam. Accordingly, when Israeli leaders sought a green light to launch a preventive strike against Iranian nuclear facilities during Bush's last year in office, his response was a firm no. The last thing the United States needed in 2008 was war with another Muslim country. Even so, AIPAC managed to kill a provision to a defense bill that would have required President Bush to get congressional authorization to use force against Iran, because doing so would, in AIPAC's view, take the use of force off the table. So as the Bush administration came to a close, individuals and groups in the lobby continued to push for a hardline American approach. In September 2008, two well-known neocons, Michael Makovsky and Michael Rubin, produced a task force report for the Bipartisan Policy Center, which portrayed Iran as a looming threat to U.S. interests and recommended that the United States demand Iran abandon all nuclear enrichment, backed up by the use of force if necessary. Which brings us to the Obama administration. At first, Obama tried to engage Tehran through several symbolic gestures and agreed to participate in direct talks on Iran's nuclear program. The two countries nearly reached a deal in 2009 on a fuel swap that would have reduced Iran's stockpile of low-enriched uranium in exchange for fuel for a small research reactor. These efforts were derailed in part by the contested Iranian election of 2009, which made a compromise much more difficult for both sides, and by miscommunication and vacillation over the terms of the fuel swap deal. Yet even as Obama supposedly extended an open hand, the United States was also tightening sanctions and ramping up covert action against Iran, culminating in the Stuxnet computer virus attack in 2010. There's also good evidence that key officials in the administration expected diplomacy to fail and were just going through the motions in order to justify the use of force later. Washington continued to demand that Iran halt all nuclear enrichment. Top officials repeatedly declared an Iranian bomb unacceptable and said that all options were on the table. Pushed by Congress, Washington orchestrated a successful international campaign to tighten economic sanctions, including the blacklisting of Iran's central bank, and then, of course, openly bragged about our diplomatic success. 4 Iranian nuclear scientists were assassinated during this period, although U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton explicitly denied that the United States was involved in any way. Taken together, these developments highlight a fundamental contradiction in the entire American approach. Washington is supposedly trying to convince Tehran that the United States has no hostile intentions and that Iran therefore has no need for a nuclear deterrent. But by ratcheting up pressure, continuing to talk about military action and regime change, it is giving Iran a clear incentive to acquire the ultimate deterrent, or at least get close to that capability. Not surprisingly, Iran has responded not by capitulating to our demands, but by building additional enrichment facilities, including an underground site near Qom that is vulnerable only to high-tech bunker-busting bombs. Fears that war might be imminent rose significantly in the fall of 2010. The Netanyahu government continued to hype the danger, and Jeffrey Goldberg wrote a cover story in the September issue of The Atlantic, which concluded that Israel was likely to strike by June 2011. Goldberg's forecast was as accurate as his earlier writings about Iraq, that is to say, it was dead wrong, but the New York Times Magazine published an updated version of the same argument by Israeli journalist Ronan Bergman last January. Bergman also suggested that time was running out, that Israel's leaders were getting close to launching a preventive strike. The possibility of war with Iran soon permeated the Republican primary contest, with Mitt Romney, Newt Gingrich, and Rick Santorum all trying to outdo each other in their expressed willingness to use force on Israel's behalf. The war fever peaked at AIPAC's annual policy conference earlier this year. Prime Minister Netanyahu told his audience, quote, Iran must never be allowed to get nuclear weapons, declared that containment was not an option, said diplomacy had failed, and that, quote, none of us can afford to wait much longer. Senator Mitch McConnell pledged to introduce legislation authorizing the use of force, and Senator Joseph Lieberman told the audience, the question is not whether we can stop them, but whether we will choose to stop them. When it comes to Iran, all options must be on the table except for one option, and that is containment. Now, let's be clear. Lieberman was saying that war will be necessary if Iran does not give in to all our demands. President Obama sought to deflect pressure for immediate action in his own remarks to AIPAC, both by denouncing what he called loose talk about war and reiterating that he had Israel's back. Yet he also told the Atlantic's Goldberg, "I do not have a policy of containment. I have a policy to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon." Now, loose talk about war has receded in recent weeks. Negotiations between Iran and the so-called P5+1 resumed in Istanbul last month. There have been some hints in the press that a deal might be in the offing, which would permit Iran to continue low-level enrichment if it reduced its stockpile of more highly enriched uranium, a step that would in effect lengthen the amount of time it would take Iran to break out and acquire a bomb. It remains to be seen if such a deal can be struck, however, especially in a presidential election year. What I want to do now is compare how these developments can be contrasted with the run-up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. There are some important similarities. The good news is there are also some key differences. The most obvious similarity, of course, is that the main advocates of a hardline approach, including the use of military force, have been the same people and groups who pushed for an attack on Iraq in 2003. Thus, William Kristol, who led the neoconservative Project for a New American Century, has since lost two new organizations, the Emergency Committee for Israel and the Foreign Policy Initiative. Both groups have hyped the threat from Iran and favor military action to keep it from crossing the nuclear weapons threshold. Kristol has said, quote, "We have an engraved invitation to speak to the Iranian regime in the language it understands, force," adding, quote, "We can stop talking and we can hit the regime's nuclear weapons program and set it back." Fellow neoconservative Royal Mark Gorecht, another prominent Iraq war advocate, began calling for an attack on Iran in 2010 and wrote after reports surfaced of an alleged Iranian plot to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here in Washington, quote, "The White House needs to respond militarily to this outrage. If we don't, we are asking for it." Michael Makovsky has continued to release alarmist reports of Iran's nuclear progress, writing in 2012 that the United States needs to make clear Iran faces a choice. It can either abandon its nuclear program or have it destroyed militarily by the United States or Israel. As you would expect, advocates of this approach have recycled the same dubious arguments they previously made about Saddam Hussein. Iran is routinely portrayed as actively seeking to get nuclear weapons, even though U.S. intelligence services believe it has no active weapons program and is probably seeking only a latent or breakout capability. Hawks describe Iran's leaders as unstable or irrational, which is precisely how they used to talk about Saddam Hussein. They warned that a nuclear Iran would be able to blackmail its neighbors, dominate the Persian Gulf, or give nuclear weapons to terrorists. They claim that failure to stop Iran would damage American credibility, trigger an arms race in the region, and lead our other Middle East allies to abandon us. And just as the neocons argued an attack on Iraq would be easy and pay for itself, advocates of war downplay the costs and risks and argue it will hasten the end of the clerical regime. What about the mainstream groups in the lobby? Organizations like AIPAC have generally refrained from making overt calls for war, but they've worked overtime to reinforce a hawkish line. AIPAC played a key role in drafting the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions, Divestment, and Accountability Act of 2010, which broadens American sanctions against Iran and authorizes punishing foreign companies that aid Iran's petroleum sector. The bill was also endorsed by the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, and by the progressive lobby J Street. It was opposed by leading business groups and by Americans for Peace Now. And by the way, that legislation passed the House by a vote of 408 to 8, and by the Senate 99 to 0. AIPAC also helped draft a congressional resolution declaring it a vital national interest of the United States to prevent the Islamic Republic from acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, and notice that meaning just the capacity to build one, and affirming that Congress opposes any policy that would rely on containment as an option in response to the Iranian nuclear threat. A 2012 AIPAC policy brief warned, quote, "The United States must quicken the pace and scope of sanctions while bolstering the credibility of its option to use force. The United States cannot rely on a policy that seeks to contain a nuclear Iran." And not to be outdone, American Jewish Committee head David Harris wrote in the New York Times in March, quote, "The United States and many other like-minded nations have no choice but to get tough. Otherwise, we face the game-changing prospect of an Iran capable of building a nuclear bomb." And notice, he's not talking about Iran with an actual weapon. He's saying we cannot tolerate an Iran that could, in theory, build one. As in 2002, therefore, key individuals and organizations in the lobby are in the forefront of those pushing for a hardline approach, and in some cases openly favoring the use of force. Equally important, it is hard to find any other powerful constituency favoring a similar course. In fact, there's considerable opposition to using force throughout the U.S. government. For example, the U.S. military is decidedly skeptical, with former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates warning, "If you think war with Iraq was hard, an attack on Iran would, in my position, be a catastrophe." Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Martin Dempsey, told CNN host Fareed Zakaria in February of this year, "An attack on Iran would not be prudent." Neither the Department of State nor the CIA favor military action. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton saying last month that war is not in anyone's interest, and Director of National Intelligence James Clapper reaffirming the CIA's earlier judgment with a high level of confidence that Iran has not made a decision as of this point to restart its nuclear weapons program. So AIPAC President David Victor was largely correct when he told members in 2009, quote, "We are the only constituency in America making this anti-Iranian case." Or as the New York Times reported earlier this year, among those advocating a more aggressive approach toward Iran are groups like the Emergency Committee for Israel and AIPAC, the so-called neocons from the Bush administration, and pro-Israel evangelicals like Gary Bauer. One should add every prominent GOP presidential candidate except Ron Paul. And again, let's not overlook the Christian Zionists like John Hagee, who declared way back in 2006 that the United States must join Israel in a preemptive military strike against Iran in order to fulfill God's plan for both Israel and the West. In short, it is not hard to find worrisome parallels between the current debate on Iran and the earlier campaign for war with Iraq. Fortunately, there are also some critical differences. One obvious difference is that no one is seriously proposing invading or occupying Iran. Instead, the debate has been whether to conduct airstrikes against Iran's nuclear facilities. The obvious weakness of that option is that it can only delay the program, not eliminate it once and for all. A second difference is that groups in the lobby are more divided on this issue than they were over the invasion of Iraq. Unlike 2002, a few voices in the pro-Israel community reject the use of force today and call for diplomacy instead. For example, both J Street and Americans for Peace Now opposed the AIPAC-sponsored resolution that rejected any policy of containment. Former U.S. official Dennis Ross, who's now a fellow at the Washington Institute and was an open supporter of war with Iraq in 2002, has been stressing the need for diplomacy in recent weeks. Other prominent pro-Israel commentators, such as Leonard Fine or Leslie Gelb, have been openly critical of the renewed emphasis on military threats as well. Third, Israel's national security establishment is far from unified about the need to strike Iran. Netanyahu has continued to hype the threat, but prominent members of Israel's defense and intelligence establishment have openly questioned whether Iran is an existential threat and warned that an Israeli strike would be foolish. The former head of the Mossad, Meir Dagan, called an Israeli airstrike the stupidest thing he had ever heard of. The current chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, General Benny Gantz, told Haaretz that "I think the Iranian leadership is composed of very rational people," adding that he did not think Supreme Leader Khamenei even wanted to go the extra mile to get nuclear weapons. The former head of Shin Bet, Yuval Diskin, warned that Israeli airstrikes could result, quote, in a dramatic acceleration of Iran's nuclear program. And then former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert told an audience here in the United States that Netanyahu's bellicose posture was jeopardizing international support, and he again emphasized the need for diplomacy. Last, but by no means least, the Obama administration seems to recognize that war with Iran is neither necessary nor wise. Its position stands in sharp contrast to Bush and Cheney, who drank the neocons' Kool-Aid after 9/11 and led a sophisticated public relations campaign to convince the American people to support an unprovoked and illegal war. Pressure from the lobby and election year politics have forced President Obama to walk a rather fine line, reaffirming support for Israel while downplaying the need to use force, though I think it's clear he believes that war would be foolish. Now, both Obama and Netanyahu's critics in Israel are right, and we should be thankful that the constellation of political forces has lined up differently today than it did before the war in Iraq. Let me briefly explain why war with Iran would be a blunder of enormous proportions. For starters, Iran is not an existential threat to anyone. Its defense spending is about $10 billion a year, less than 2% of what the United States spends. It has no significant power projection capabilities. It also has no powerful allies. Second, although it would be better if Iran did not develop nuclear weapons, achieving the capacity to make a few bombs won't transform the region or turn Iran into a regional superpower. Several of Iran's neighbors already have arsenals of their own, and Iran could not use its weapons without facing devastating retaliation. Iran could not blackmail or coerce anyone for the same reasons that the Soviet Union couldn't blackmail other countries when it had thousands of nuclear weapons and sophisticated long-range missiles. Nor are Iranians likely to give any weapons that they have struggled for decades to acquire to some terrorist group, because of course they would be giving up all control over them. Contrary to what alarmists in the lobby might tell you, there's no evidence that Iran's leaders don't fully understand these basic realities. Third, Tehran has not yet decided to build a weapon, and there are good reasons why it might prefer not to. But if Israel or the United States attacks, that is bound to convince Iran's leaders that they have no choice but to acquire a real deterrent in the form of their own nuclear arsenal. Ironically, attacking Iran, or even continually threatening it with regime change, may be the best way to push Iran across the nuclear threshold. Fourth, our experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan ought to teach us that war is unpredictable and messy, and the costs can be enormous and victory elusive. A war would drive up oil prices, threaten a global economic recovery that is still on life support. Iran would surely seek to retaliate in various ways. Groups like Hezbollah might join in by firing rockets at Israel itself. And even a successful airstrike could not stop Iran from digging out and redoubling its efforts, just as Saddam Hussein did after Israel bombed the Osirak reactor in 1981. Fifth, an Israeli or U.S. attack would rally Persian nationalism and give the clerical regime a new lease on life. Iran's current government is not wildly popular. Many younger Iranians would like closer and more open ties with the West. But if Israel or the United States attacks, an Iranian-American détente will be set back for years. Lastly, the whole debate about Iran has been a giant distraction from other key regional issues, which may be precisely what Netanyahu and AIPAC want. Obama's initial efforts to encourage a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians has been stymied ever since 2009. Many responsible observers in Israel, the Arab world, and the United States now worry that a two-state solution is becoming impossible, or will be very soon. This situation is a looming threat for Israel, a continual headache for the United States, and of course a disaster for the Palestinians. For if two states are not achieved, the only alternatives are one-state democracy, ethnic cleansing to remove all Palestinians from Greater Israel, or some form of permanent apartheid. Those last two alternatives are obviously contrary to key American values, and in my view, all three options would consign these two peoples to another generation of bitter strife. This is not simply an abstract matter of grand strategy or realpolitik. It is also a matter of genuine human suffering, as Palestinians face the denial of basic rights, the steady encroachment of Israeli settlers, repeated home demolitions and expulsions, the imprisonment of thousands of family members, the daily degradation of checkpoints that stifle commerce and keep families apart, inadequate access to water, attacks by settler gangs that have increased by over 200% in the past 2 years, and countless other humiliations, large and small. Not to mention actual killings, including nearly 5,000 in the Second Intifada, nearly 1,400 in Operation Cast Lead, and 258 since then. Israelis have also died tragic deaths during this period, but in far smaller numbers. None of this is in America's strategic interest, especially given the winds of change that are now blowing through the Arab world. No matter how the Arab Spring ultimately turns out, future Arab governments will be more responsive to public sentiment than autocrats like Hosni Mubarak were. And because the Palestinian issue continues to resonate among Arab populations, the continued denial of Palestinian rights will force the United States to pay an increasingly high price for its special relationship, and especially if the hopeful vision of 2 states for 2 peoples is replaced by permanent apartheid. This is not to say that Iran can be ignored, but it should be obvious what the proper course of action is. Having gotten Iran back to the bargaining table, the United States should take the threat of regime change off the table so that Iran has less incentive to weaponize. We should acknowledge that Iran is entitled to enrich uranium in accordance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, provided it agrees to full inspections under the IAEA and implements the so-called additional protocol. Washington and the other members of the P5 should explain to Tehran why it is in fact better off without a nuclear arsenal, both because some of its neighbors might follow suit and because possessing an actual nuclear arsenal would make it more likely to be a suspect if some terrorist group ever acquired and used a bomb. And Washington should also be willing to begin wide-ranging discussions on broader regional security issues, such as Afghanistan, where American and Iranian interests might actually overlap. Given the legacy of suspicion on both sides, as well as deep internal divisions, none of this is going to be easy. But this course makes far more sense than another war or another 30 years of confrontation. And given that the United States and its allies are far stronger and far more secure than Iran, we can pursue this course without worrying that our security is going to be at risk. Lastly, if this approach fails, and Iran does someday end up testing a nuclear weapon, we can in fact rely on a policy of containment which worked well against the far more powerful Soviet Union. Let's not forget, after all, who won the Cold War. Most groups in the lobby won't like this advice, and we should expect them to continue to beat the drums for war on occasion. Remember, the neocons began lobbying for war with Iraq in the mid-1990s, and their efforts finally succeeded in 2003. The lobby's efforts to drum up a war scare have failed this time around, but it would be naive to assume that they won't try again. When dealing with AIPAC and the neoconservatives, it seems, the price of peace is eternal vigilance. Thank you very much.
I did have one question that I wanted to have you respond to before we open it up. You mentioned that American intelligence estimates said one thing, while the rhetoric that we heard from Israeli politicians was completely different. Yet it seemed that it was what was going on in the Israeli political discourse that was reported here, which was elevating or decreasing the drums for war. When generals came out recently and said, well, you know, we think Iran is a rational actor, we're not as crazy about this as our prime minister is, it seemed that confrontation was less likely. And I wonder now that with recent political developments within Israel, where the Israeli prime minister has broadened his coalition, brought within a large partner that has particular weight within the military establishment, whether you think there's reason to think that that will change now and we can be hearing the drums of war increase again in the coming months.
I actually haven't the slightest idea what the implications of the revised Israeli governing coalition are. And I've spent some time in the last sort of 2 days reading commentary both in Israel and elsewhere on what the political significance of all this means. And I think the safe conclusion is that nobody really knows. You get people who believe that Netanyahu, by creating what is now the largest coalition, governing coalition in Israeli history, is now free to do whatever he wants, and that the Kadima leader, Mufaz, is essentially on board, even though he has previously been a skeptic, at least at certain times, about the possibility of a war. You have other commentators who say, in fact, no, it's exactly the opposite. He now has brought some more moderates into the coalition. He doesn't have to pay as much attention to the real hardliners, people who are even to the right of Netanyahu. So I don't think that there's any clear consensus, and I don't have a strong view of my own of what this actually means. I will say something slightly different. I actually believe that much of the hype about a possible Israeli strike against Iran has been largely a bluff. That if you look at what Israel's actual military capabilities are, what their air force could actually accomplish against Iran, they could not, in fact, do enough damage to Iran's program to really be worth doing it. And one problem is that the new facility that the Iranians have built, which is an underground facility in Fordo, it's under 30 meters or so of solid rock. The Israelis don't have any planes that can carry a bunker-busting bomb big enough to destroy that. So they can't eliminate Iran's enrichment capability entirely on their own. And therefore, the threat to go unilaterally, I think, is not a particularly credible one. Now, you could tell a story about that they would start something in the hopes of getting the United States involved, but it seems to me that's an extraordinary gamble to take, particularly given the fact that the Obama administration, like the Bush administration in its final year in office, has, I think, sent unmistakable signals that we do not want the Israelis to go. So to go ahead anyway in the face of American insistence that they shouldn't go, on the expectation that we would then be forced to come in and help them, I think is a gamble that you're not likely to see. So in a sense, I'm not sure the reconfiguration of the ruling coalition in Israel is as important as the sort of larger strategic realities, and I certainly hope I'm right.
Okay, so we have a number of hands up, and we're going to also get to questions from our online viewers. So let's start right here, and just wait one moment for the microphone so that everyone can hear you online as well. Go ahead, sir. Make sure that's on. Just one moment. Is it on?
I am the ambassador.
I can repeat the question if we...
Hello? Yeah.
Okay, I will try to raise my voice. It's okay.
Go ahead.
I'm the ambassador of the League of Arab States here. There are two questions that are very short. I will make it so I'll give opportunity to the others. You didn't refer to the coming meeting on the 23rd of May, I think, in Baghdad, which this might end all the arguments of, Iran. Perhaps Iran can reach a deal with 5+1, and then, of course, we'll give this a credit to Al-Malki and to Baghdad after the meeting in Istanbul. This is one. The other one, what do you think that we should do as Arab countries and Muslim countries, and of course the Palestinians also, in face of this huge and strong lobbies, pro-Israeli lobbies here, especially if we know that the United States, they enjoy very close and excellent relationship with among the closest allies of the ICS are Arab and Muslim countries.
Well, obviously, if there are two questions. One is, what about the meeting that's upcoming next month in Baghdad, where the P5+1 are going to be meeting again with an Iranian negotiating team? Maybe this whole problem will go away if they can reach a deal. Yes, I think much of the debate about a possibility of war would diminish greatly if they do succeed in reaching a deal. I am not optimistic that they will walk out of the Baghdad meeting, shaking hands with a document that's been signed. I think it will take more time for each side to sort of come to some understanding, although there have been some interesting hints in the press about the form that such a deal might take. And I alluded to it in my talk. It would basically be a deal where Iran would agree to give up some quantity of more highly enriched, 20% enriched uranium. We would agree that they could continue to enrich a certain amount of low enriched uranium, which can be used as reactor fuel, and that becomes the sort of beginnings of a package. I believe, and by the way, the reason that deal is attractive is it makes it a longer timetable for Iran. If it subsequently decided it wanted to get a bomb, it would take longer. Other people would have more time to respond to that. If they come out with a deal like that, I think the danger of war goes down, but I think the deal will be heavily scrutinized, and lots of people will be opposed to it because a number of the voices that I quoted in my talk don't want Iran to be in any position at any point to ever be able to develop a nuclear weapon. And frankly, I think that's simply unrealistic. We live in a world where lots of countries, including countries that have really primitive economies like North Korea, have been able to develop nuclear weapons. It's simply impossible to make it impossible for countries with a reasonable degree of technical facility to do that. The second question was, what can Arab states, the Palestinians, and others do about the impact of the Israel lobby in the United States? Everything that, well, if I had a quick and easy answer to that, I'd really be a genius, but I don't. It's very powerful interest groups, and the way our country operates, well-organized interest groups like the National Rifle Association, the Farm Lobby, and the Israel Lobby are difficult to counter. I think the United States, or others who think the United States needs to change its policies, have to be very patient and very articulate about explaining why these policies are not in America's interests and not good for us, for our other friends in the region. And I think if there's a chance of a real shift is that there is slowly starting to be more of a debate within the pro-Israel community here in the United States, where I think more and more people are beginning to understand that the policies that groups like AIPAC have been pushing are actually not good for the United States, but also not good for Israel either. And that's, I think, the more likely to be the sort of route to change in the future. I wish I could be more optimistic.
Before we take our next question here, I just want to get one in from Twitter. Also, do we have our microphone sorted out? Okay. Sorry about that before, but a user asks, what do you think about the potential of a revived peace process during Obama's second term?
Well, there's certainly a case to be made for that. The sort of standard conventional wisdom has always been that when presidents get a second term, then when they no longer have to worry about re-election, they're willing to be somewhat bolder in doing this. And for example, you did see President Bush do a sort of half-hearted series of gestures towards the peace process in his second term. I'm not sure that's really why he did it. So yes, you could make a argument that if President Obama is reelected, he'll be able to do more. I guess I'm more skeptical of that because ultimately he is going to have to take on some pretty entrenched, pretty powerful political forces. And I think it's an open question to ask, which I admit I haven't fully made up my own mind on, whether or not the so-called two-state solution can be resurrected at this point. I think maybe if you had, real visionaries on all sides and an American administration that was willing to make that a very serious foreign policy priority, then you might be able to pull it off. But absent that, I don't think that's likely to happen. And I guess after the experiences of the first term, I'm not as confident as I was, say, in 2009, that something might change. Now, if you want a slightly more optimistic interpretation, you could say that presidents also learn in their first term, and they learn some things that they might have done differently. And so you could imagine a second term President Obama saying, okay, now that I've got this Iranian, let's assume that there's some kind of progress made on the Iranian issue. Then he comes back, I said back in 2009, 2 states for 2 peoples. I went to Cairo. I meant it. We really need to do something about this. And so I'm going to go back to the region. I'm going to give a talk in Jerusalem. I'm going to explain this to the Israeli people, what my position is. I'm going to give a talk somewhere else in the Arab world to explain what my position is, and I'm really going to make this a priority. I've sort of solved the other things I needed to deal with. I've gotten us out of Iraq. I'm getting us out of Afghanistan, and this will be my last big foreign policy push. And I made some mistakes back in 2009. I've learned from those mistakes, and I'm going to do it a little bit differently next time around. I could see something like that happening. I think you might also have to put some new people in charge in various key positions to pull that off. But I can't rule it out. And I am by nature an optimist.
Let's go to the other side of the room back there, and then we'll come across this way.
My name is Said Arkat, and my question to you, actually, you've mentioned. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. My question to you is quite simple. Why isn't all this hype about Iran actually is a masterful thing, really to derail attention, as you mentioned, but not really in focus enough by the pro-Israeli lobby, the pro-settlement lobby, to actually allow Netanyahu, as we have seen in the last year and so, increase settlement activity by 20%. And my second issue was also asked to you by Twitter. You said that the two-state solution is coming to an end, the possibility of the two-state solution. Could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
The two questions are: is the Iran issue merely a distraction that's being used to sort of take attention away from the Israeli-Palestinian issue and the continued expansion of settlements? And then, why do I think that maybe the two-state solution is dead, coming to an end? A couple of things. I don't think it's entirely a distraction. If I were an Israeli, I would worry about Iran as a potential adversary. I would be bothered by the fact that Iran has supported Hezbollah. I would be upset by the fact that Iran has supported groups like Islamic Jihad. So this is not something they're completely conjuring up out of nowhere. And if I were an Israeli, I'd be worried about Iran getting nuclear weapons. For the same reasons that the United States has tended to oppose other countries getting nuclear weapons. We would like to have a lot of them ourselves and have nobody else get them. That would be a perfect world. We haven't had that world, but we've wanted to be as close to that world as possible. We didn't do very much to stop Israel, but we didn't like it when Israel got nuclear weapons either. So I don't think it's just a distraction. Now, it is, at the same time, a very useful issue to focus everyone's attention, because it does divert attention away from other issues that they perhaps don't want the United States or the rest of the international community focusing on. But I don't think it's entirely sort of made up. The question that Israelis and Americans ought to be asking is, what's the best way to convince a country not to cross the nuclear threshold? And I have never thought that pointing a gun at another regime is the way to convince them that they don't need some way of defending themselves, some way of deterring a possible attack. So continuing to talk about how we're going to come get them and we want to overthrow their government is not exactly the best way to convince them not to go across the nuclear threshold. As far as why the two-state solution, may be dead or on life support at best, I think it's sort of two reasons. One is simply the facts on the ground. If one goes to the West Bank and looks where the settlements are and looks where the roads are and the checkpoints and the control of aquifers, and you ask, is it possible now to imagine creating a viable Palestinian state in those lands? It's looking harder and harder with each house that gets built, with each family that moves in. And couple that with the fact that Israeli internal politics has been drifting steadily rightward over the last 10 years. The so-called peace camp in Israel is no longer nearly as powerful as it once was. So you have a combination of far greater changes would have to be agreed to by Israel in order to make a viable two-state solution, at the same time that Israeli politics is moving in a direction that makes those changes harder and harder to pull off. So again, you can't rule it out, because anything human beings can create, human beings can undo, but it's hard for me to imagine that you could really get this to happen anytime soon, and there is a point of no return. I'll just add one other point to that.
If I could push you here.
I don't know. I don't know. I've tried to think about this, because again, I can't say anything is impossible, but I do believe there will be a point, and some people believe we've already passed this point, but there will be a point where it's going to be obvious to everybody that the Oslo process really failed, that 2 states for 2 peoples is simply not going to happen. I'm not saying we're past that point, but I think if we continue with the direction we're going, we will get there. And then there's going to be a moment where an American Secretary of State or spokesman or president will get asked the question, Mr. President, what do you favor now? What is your policy with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And if he says, or she says, we favor a 2-state solution, everyone in the room will just laugh. No one will take it seriously. It will be seen as completely unrealistic, someone at odds with reality. And if we get to the point that an American leader cannot defend the 2-state solution, then the next question is, well, if you can't have a 2-state solution, what do you favor? 1-state democracy? That sounds an awful lot like America, right? No group having advantages, no group favored, 1 person, 1 vote, regardless of race, religion, creed. That sounds a lot like America. What are your alternatives to 1-state democracy, Mr. President? Permanent apartheid? That doesn't sound very much like America. Ethnic cleansing? That doesn't sound like something we're supposed to be in favor of anymore. So it's a very awkward moment for that American leader at the point at which a 2-state solution is no longer seen as even remotely possible. And I would, if I had 5 minutes with President Obama, which I'm unlikely ever to get, but I would be telling him, if you want you or your successors not to face that question, you ought to get serious about it while there is still some time left.
Gentleman right here has been waiting patiently. Go ahead, sir.
What is your view about sanctions? Are they wise, and are they likely to be successful?
Thank you.
Well, I guess like everyone else, I prefer sanctions to war. Like almost everyone else, I prefer sanctions to war. But I just remind everybody, we've been sanctioning Iran now for 20-plus years, in fact, by some measures, ever since the Iranian Revolution. And the result has been the exact opposite of what we claim to want to get. Right? What we were trying to get was an end to Iran's nuclear enrichment program. And as I said in my talk, in 2000, Iran wasn't enriching anything. And by 2008, they had 4,000 centrifuges running, even though we'd started sanctioning them back in the 90s, and we were continuing to ramp up the sanctions. And we've continued to do so as well. So if this is the policy that will ultimately bring Iran to its knees, it hasn't worked yet. They are much closer to whatever that nuclear threshold is than they were when we started putting the squeeze on them. Second, the sanctions obviously impose a considerable amount of suffering on the Iranian people, which can't be good for our overall relationship with them. And they are contrary to our efforts to convey to Iran that we would like to have a better relationship. Now, it's possible, I don't know this, it's possible that the sanctions are squeezing them to some degree, and that this is one of the things that's encouraged Iran now to come to the bargaining table and be willing to talk to us. At which point we have to decide if we're willing to take some form of yes for an answer. I think there is no evidence to suggest that Iran will ever agree to suspend all nuclear enrichment. This is a matter of national pride. It's a very important issue, and it's across the political spectrum. The leaders of the Green Movement, the opposition movement in Iran, were among the founders of Iran's nuclear program. So even if you got regime change in Iran, a new Iranian government would almost certainly want to have an enrichment capacity as well. So we're going to have to find some deal where we back off a little bit from what we've been insisting, and hopefully we get reciprocal concessions from Iran that satisfy our concerns and persuade them that, again, staying on this side of the nuclear threshold makes more strategic sense for them as well.
I just want to take one more question from Twitter, and then we'll take one more from the room. A user asks, do you think that an airstrike almost guarantees a ground war to follow?
No. I believe that the United States, if it doesn't learn quickly, it has learned a few things in the last decade. And I think we have learned that sending large amounts of U.S. forces into countries where they're not welcome is not a very good idea. I would also remind everybody that Iran's population is substantially larger than that of Iraq. Iraq, is roughly 30 million or so, and I think Iran is around 70 or 80 million. or so. So this is a substantially larger country and a substantially more populous country. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates was right. If you think Iraq was hard work, trying to occupy or conquer Iran is really a fool's errand. And therefore, even if, contrary to everything I think makes sense, the United States decided to use military force in the form of airstrikes against Iran, I can't imagine any circumstances where we would send substantial numbers of American troops there.
I'm just going to take a final question from the gentleman who's waiting in the corner there. He's been waiting patiently. Just 1 second, the microphone will be there.
Okay, so I guess one question was, with oil at $100 a barrel or so, there's a lot of coal in the United States, a lot of oil sands in Canada and Venezuela. How does that change? I mean, and I believe that like the Fischer-Tropsch process to convert coal to oil is profitable at below like $60 or $70 a barrel. So I was wondering how that changes the strategic position a little bit. And then one more quick question is, have you heard any of what William Benny's interview, who is a former technical director at the NSA? He had an interview on Democracy Now! About, he resigned from the NSA, and he was, his opinion at this point was that the government has everyone's emails and that kind of thing. And, and he's a technical director at the NSA, so, at least it's worth listening to, right? And they're building a large data center out in Utah, right? The NSA is building. That's true. And then,
can you conclude the question?
Is there a question?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay. So I guess my question is what do you think about how that influences? You're saying, you don't I guess there was one post. Excuse me.
Why don't we try to get a response to your first question in relation to the price of natural resources in the war?
Yeah. On the first issue, to what extent does the possibility of alternative energy sources change some of this? If in fact the United States has access to other sources of energy at market prices, then you could imagine a world where the Persian Gulf matters less. And we don't worry about it in general as much. I think we're some distance away from that sort of a world, and this is not my field. I am not an expert on energy sources or not, but I would just add that it is not necessarily a good thing if we have more abundant and cheaper sources of fossil fuels, because while we busily drive more SUVs because we can now afford the gas, we increasingly alter the Earth's climate. I recommend, if you want to be really scared, read James Hansen's op-ed in today's New York Times about how using coal sands from Canada might solve our problems with the Persian Gulf, but cause all sorts of other problems with the environment. So I think we have to be thinking much more broadly about energy issues. On the question of the NSA, which never quite got asked, I'll just say the following thing is that we ought to recognize there is a broader set of problems created by sort of having these constant war scares. And that is that it's, I think, a mechanism by which the American people are constantly being told that there are great and looming dangers out there and that horrible things are likely to happen. And therefore, you should not complain if people want to read your emails, if we want to send drones into any country we feel like it, if we want to prosecute whistleblowers very aggressively. This is something, by the way, that the Obama administration has done with great enthusiasm. And it's all part of a world in which we, again, with thousands of nuclear weapons, more defense spending than the next 20 countries put together, protected by two enormous oceans, and with a highly advanced and robust economy relative to many others, we somehow managed to get ourselves scared by what are ultimately very small problems, and I think that mostly has to do with the way in which politics is done here in the United States and much less about what's really going on in the world today. And that's one of the reasons that you have data centers in the NSA and things like that out there too.
Professor Walt, thank you very much.
Thank
you all for coming. Thank you.